a little bit with all of you. Oh no, Zoom's asking me to.
That's okay.
Oh,
Watch just me pressing
just
to.
recording, no problem. Thought it wanted me to update. I'm really excited to share with all of you a little bit about my research, but then also a little bit about the People 3000 Research Network, and in particular, the investments we are making in uh, data infrastructure so that we can realize the great potential, I think, of comparing the long-term dynamics of socio-environmental systems and trying to understand what makes some systems more fragile than others, which is a key component of, for me anyway, thinking about sustainability. So, as you can see from the title of my talk today, I'm going to be speaking about risk and fragility in prehistoric populations. I'm going to be focusing in particular on the fragility of populations and the regulatory mechanisms of human population dynamics, which we actually don't understand that well collectively as a field of ecologists, as anthropologists, as human ecologists. There's been a lot of progress, but a big challenge has been just lack of data for many years, because it's hard to get good long-term time series on human populations so that you can actually study the processes. And that feeds into the People 3000 research infrastructure efforts that we're really making. All right, so a quick outline of where I'm going to go. We're going to talk about the research question that's going to motivate this talk very quickly. Then I'm going to introduce the concepts of intensification and systemic risk. Systemic risk results from the realization of a fragility, a system becoming fragile, and then crossing some kind of threshold in which positive feedback processes reinforce some kind of negative outcome, or outcome that we think is negative, like population loss. We're going to be talking about rapid population collapse, very large scale population secular decline today, but we can also think about systemic risk, for instance, of the banking system, to a loss of trust. When you lose trust, this leads to a self reinforcing cycle in which money gets pulled out of banks. People lose trust in the banks, more money gets pulled out, so on and so forth, and that depresses the ability to lend capital, and economic system collapses. We can think about this in a bunch of different contexts. And then I'll conclude and talk about the People 3000 research infrastructure, and how some are thinking about the fragility of human populations plays into thinking about socio-environmental systems in general, and trying to do large-scale comparative studies of the long-term trajectories of change in socio-environmental systems. All right, so let's go with the basic research question that motivates the study that I'm going to present today. And this relates to the wicked problem of sustainability. I call it a wicked problem because there are two interacting variables or sets of variables, and they're interacting in nonlinear ways. So the first is human population. So what you have over here is a cartoon sort of graph of world population growth over the last 350 years or so, projected into the future. And you see some kind of density dependent process going on. And as I said, we don't really understand the regulators of this kind of long-term growth process in human societies all that well. We have some ideas that it's related to food production and innovations in food production. And that's kind of where we'll be starting today. But honestly, we don't have a great understanding of that. And then that's multiplied by climate change and variability in the climate, volatility in the climate, which is continuous. And of course, it's changing. The volatility of the climate today is changing in ways that are perhaps outside of the human experience, the norms of the human experience, in particular, the experience of the Holocene. But perhaps, our ancestors a couple million years ago experienced something similar, but certainly we haven't over the last 11,000 years or so. So the volatility of the climate is changing in ways that are outside the bounds of our previous experiences. So these two things are interacting in nonlinear ways, and so we need to understand as human populations are regulated by these food production processes, what makes them more or less fragile in the face of volatility, and in particular changes in volatility. So the place to start there is to look at what makes human populations more or less fragile in the face of volatility, in particular climate volatility that's constantly hitting systems. Okay, so to summarize this, why do some population systems display more robustness or fragility to volatility, in particular climate, but you can also think about globalization as a source of volatility as societies become wired up, as human populations become wired up. You get flows of disease, flows of migrants. These can also be a source of volatility for any particular system that you've drawn bounds around than others. So why do some population systems display more fragility to volatility than others? Here, when we talk about fragility, talking about the ability of a system to cope with disturbances or environmental changes and maintain its long-term structure, okay? So if we've got some kind of long-term population growth pattern and this system is being hit by constant volatility, which all are, if it's fragile, then it's going to become sensitive to that volatility and be vulnerable to a rapid and large-scale population decline, secular decline in population, which is, in this case, what we're talking about when we think about systemic risk, the risk that a population system could experience that rapid secular decline, large scale. All right, so in order to think about this, we need to think about the mechanisms that regulate human population. And so one of the key mechanisms or factors that a lot of people for many years, starting with Malthus and all the way up through Bossrup and debates about Malthus and Bossrup have thought about regulating human populations is this process of intensification. And intensification is the ability to produce food, in particular, substitute what I'm going to call technological and social capital for natural capital. So rip out that ecosystem and put in place technological capital or infrastructure and social infrastructures that allow you to produce more food per unit area. And of course, this may infect systemic risk in populations by one, producing more food, which provides more room for population growth, or less food, which would provide room for less population growth, but then it also may introduce fragilities to volatility. So if you invest in too much of one type of infrastructure, for instance, a very large irrigation system, it may be really useful for dealing with annual changes in rainfall that are within the bounds of your experience, but it may be really poor for dealing with rare, large changes in rainfall that cause massive flood events that then destroy the irrigation system, and you don't have the capital built up to deal with that cost. And now your food production system suddenly declines in a way that was unexpected. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to deal with this process of intensification and the way it may impact the fragility of human populations to large-scale decline by thinking about human resource models or the process of intensification in consumer resource models. And there have been about a dozen dynamical systems models that demonstrate what I'm going to call a robustness fragility or productivity fragility trade-off associated with intensification, this process of substituting technological and social infrastructure for natural infrastructure to produce more food. That increases the productivity of an environment for humans. That can also make the system really robust to known sets of environmental variations, but fragile to unknown or unanticipated sources of volatility, or even sources of volatility that in the past, under conditions of secular long-term population growth, the system could handle. But after enough population growth and enough doubling down on the intensification strategies used, the system can then become sensitive to that source of variability. And so the key mechanism here relates to options, which I'll go into a little bit more, but more options in a system for the human population to produce food means more variability because you're maintaining optionality, you're maintaining the ability to go into many different kinds of food production strategies, which means less short-term productivity because you're not investing in one place and modifying that place in a massive way, but also less systemic risk of failure. So in order to illustrate this for you, I'm going to take you through one model very quickly. I'm not going to go into the details of it, the mathematical details, but I just want to take you through it really quickly to illustrate what I'm talking about, and then move into the use of radiocarbon records to try and challenge this model and these ideas with some real data that are attempting to track long-term changes in human population. All right, so the model is an idealized agroecosystem after Anderies 2006. This is highly simplified. The whole point of this model is to get a stylized model that allows us to see in a clear way robustness and fragility trade-offs in a human resource system that's undergoing intensification. So there are two dynamical systems, or two, differential equations that make up this dynamical system, and they are coupled through a decision-making process that allocates labor. The first equation is here. The only thing you need to know about this is that X1 is the change in extensive biomass. This is biomass that people can harvest through foraging activities. Above ground biomass is the result of the growth of the biomass. That's what this whole term here is. And there's some kind of environmental variable term that is constantly hitting this thing, climate variation driving around, disturbing the growth of biomass, minus or less the harvest and decay of biomass. So we just have growth of biomass less the harvest and decay of biomass. And this is coupled with another natural infrastructure. So in this case, soil fertility, which grows as a function of the replenishing of soil nutrients due to flooding in this case, or irrigation in an agricultural system, less the intensity of use of this agricultural system. So if you really, really intensively use a plot over and over again, you can deplete the soil fertility. So these two differential equations are coupled via labor allocation to either harvesting wild biomass or investing in an irrigation system to produce crops. In this case, we're thinking about maize. This was done in a North American context, but you can think about this in general. So the key thing I want to note here is that you can parameterize this in a couple of different ways. We can set the labor allocation function, which is an optimal labor allocation function at every time step in the model. The average agent is saying, okay, what's the best way for me to allocate my labor to produce the most food? We can set this a couple of different ways. We can set it so that there's minimal investment in irrigation, which we're going to call ecological intensification. So we're only going to minimally invest in irrigation. We're going to get most of our food from this wild resource biomass. Or we can set it so that we can invest a lot in irrigation, build massive canals, and invest a lot in technological infrastructure. So we shift, and we're getting most of our food from the massive production of crops and supplementing our food with wild resource biomass. And I'm going to call that technological intensification. Remember, intensification we're thinking about here is substituting technological and social infrastructure for natural ecosystem infrastructure, ripping it out, substituting it for that to produce more food per unit area. Okay, so if we analyze this model, we can use what's called a phase plane analysis. And I'm going to take you through this pretty quickly. You don't need to know all the details of these phase planes and what's going on here to understand the insight that this model gives us. But just real quickly, okay, we've got two state variables in this model. We've got the change in wild biomass, above ground biomass, and we've got the change in soil fertility, or you might even think about this as below ground. All right. Those are state variables. Those are graphed on each one of these graphs on the X and the Y axis. So here we have wild resource stock. Here we have the soil fertility stock. Okay. And then we have what are called isoclines. These are the points in the model in which soil fertility is not changing. That's this thick black line here. And all the points in the model in which wild resource stock is not changing. That's this gray line here. And where they intersect, that's called a joint equilibria or equilibrium. We have multiple joint equilibria in this model. Where they join, that's a joint equilibrium. And this is the point in which biomass and wild resource stock and the soil fertility are not changing. The key thing that I want you to know here is that in this model, there is a productive equilibrium or joint equilibrium in which all of the food production needs of this society are being met, both in terms of subsistence and political economic organization. And there's a depressed equilibrium, that's the red dot over here, where wild resource stock has collapsed, soil fertility is pretty high, and all of the food needs of the society are not being met, okay? And a key to understand what's going on here is that we basically run a set of model experiments at low population density under ecological intensification, low population density under technological intensification, and then high population density in each one of these conditions. And the thing you need to look at is this gray area, shaded area here. The gray shaded area is literally a measure of the fragility of this system's configuration under low population density, a measure of this system's fragility under high population density to volatility, right? It is what some researchers call the safe operating space. It is all of the points in the model for which an initial condition will move to a recovery to this productive equilibrium. So let's say we start a model run at a resource stock of 0.6, simulating a small drought, about a mild drought, and soil fertility being really high. If we start that model here, the model will eventually converge to this equilibrium. In resilience literature, that's one way to capture the idea of resilience. It comes from dynamical systems model. If you have a really large space in which the system will return to a productive equilibrium where all of the key outputs of the system are maintained, you have a high degree of resilience, or conversely, a low degree of fragility. So here we have a system that's not very fragile. We have a lot of places where we can start it and it will recover to a nice equilibrium. And as we increase population density and increase the intensification of production, this gray area declines. That's what I want you to look at. The fragility of the system goes up, meaning it becomes more sensitive to volatility, especially climate volatility that might drive it over here outside of this safe operating space. So you get a drought, people respond by trying to harvest more food from the wild resource biomass. That doesn't work. They don't get sufficient food. So what do? They work harder. In this model, they work harder, and boom, you drive this thing all the way down through a positive feedback process into a depressed equilibrium. This is the idea of systemic risk, this positive feedback getting initiated by this shock, this mild drought. So as you move from a low population density to a high population density under ecological intensification, the system becomes more fragile. It becomes more vulnerable to a shock in the food production system that should feed into the population system and cause a population decline, a large-scale population decline. If you're in this gray window here, you're dealing with climate variation that's affecting your food production system some, but you can recover quickly, and so it's not going to feed into your population system nearly as much. It's being regulated. Intensification processes, production processes are regulating the impact of that volatility on food production and population. So as we move to technological intensification, we see the same thing. Low population density, really large gray window. This is a system that is not very fragile. We get very high population density. We increase the fragility of the system by decreasing this safe operating space. Now, the thing I want you to note here is that this high population density is about 10 times higher than this high population density, meaning this system is much, much more productive. This way of constructing your niche leads to a much higher carrying capacity than this way of constructing your niche. But the trade-off of that is that this system is vulnerable to a different kind of systemic collapse, and that's one in which we come down here into this depressed equilibrium due to some kind of drought, and where wild resource stock is completely depressed and soil fertility is completely depressed. Over here, if you cross this tipping point for some reason, and you go into this depressed state, you still have a bunch of soil fertility that you can draw on. You can invest in agriculture more and start to recover this system in a different way. Over here, you completely knock down both. If you end up in this place, you don't see it coming. Now, both natural infrastructure stocks have collapsed. And so the idea here is that under intensification, as I said, whether it's ecological intensification or technological intensification, you increase the productivity of the system, but you also increase the fragility of the system or the sensitivity of that system to volatility. That's what we call the within effect, okay? So and then the between effect is this idea that if you invest in technological intensification, you make your system more fragile, but you might make it even more fragile or more susceptible to a very, very, very severe population decline because you don't have any natural infrastructure to use to recover from that collapse of your production system. So you're more sensitive to very, very, very severe collapses. All right, so we can summarize this in a couple of hypotheses for real agroecosystems or populations that have experienced long-term secular increases in population density in terms of their changes in population. So basic population is that they all, or prediction or hypothesis, is that they all display right-skewed distributions of change indicative of a robustness fragility trade-off. This is the within effect. That means most of the time, these systems are not fragile. The intensification of production, that is the adaptation of individuals, is working. And these populations under constant climate volatility are able to regulate their population. They don't bounce, the population doesn't bounce around that much. They're able to produce food, or if there's a bad year, recover in their production of food very quickly. However, so most changes in population are very small. However, every once in a while, if the system becomes very fragile, then you can experience some of these rapid, very large changes. That would be sort of an outlier population change event. So that's the within effect. We should see this in all systems that have undergone agricultural intensification under long-term increases in population density or coincident with long-term increases in population density. And the between effect, this is the idea that more landscape engineering reduces the optionality of a system, that is, reduces your ability to recover by investing in untapped sources of natural infrastructure. That increases, you invest in technological intensification that can increase your robustness to climate volatility and the productivity of the system, but it makes the system more vulnerable to very, very severe collapses. So you might expect, if we looked at real systems, one that followed the ecological intensification pathway, when it collapsed, its collapse was less severe than a system that followed the technological intensification pathway. Okay, so to summarize this in terms of empirical analysis, we can look at the skewing of population growth rates. If we have a time series of population under ecological intensification, it should look something like this. Most changes should be small, a few large. These are kind of big collapse events. Under technological intensification, there should be many, many more small changes because variability in the food production system through technological infrastructure is being controlled more, but the system is more fragile under really high population density. So you get this really, really rare, really big collapse event, okay? And so we can actually measure the sensitivity. A way to quantify the sensitivity of these population systems is if we have a time series of population, we can look at the growth rates, the distribution of growth rates, and then we can log transform the absolute value of each growth rate and the proportion of those growth rates in this distribution into a power function. And we can look at the slope of that power function. And the slope of that power function is a measure of the sensitivity of the system. And we should expect populations that engage in ecological intensification to have a shallower slope than those that experience technological intensification. That is, more moderate scale fluctuations, but not this really big outlier event. Over here, more really small fluctuations, not many moderate fluctuations, which causes the slope of this line to become steeper. So then we can compare the slopes of these lines across different population systems. Well, as I said earlier, a big challenge for trying to move from models to hypotheses to actual data is to challenge these kind of models with data, because we haven't had long-term time series of human populations. And so one of the efforts that our group has made has been to do this using radiocarbon records as a measure of human occupation intensity. Archaeological radiocarbon as a measure of the intensity of human occupation or energy output in a given area. And there are biases related to these, which we try to deal with, but I won't go into here just for the sake of clarity of the presentation. And we use those records to get long-term time series. And we did that with 6 cases that are original part of the People 3000 research group along a gradient in North America from what's called the Eastern Freeman here in Utah down to the Mogollon Highlands in Arizona and New Mexico. So we looked at the Eastern Fremont, the ancestral Pueblo, and the Mogollon region. In South America, we have a similar gradient from Titicaca to northern Chile in the Atacama Desert into northwest Patagonia in central west Argentina. So we had really good radiocarbon records for each one of these cases. Each one of these cases experienced exponential-like population growth over the last 4,000 years, and adopted agriculture and intensified the production of agriculture over the last 4,000 years in these regions. So if we put the radiocarbon records together to get a population time series, this is in the log scale here on your left, and we look at years cal-BP and the normalized, well, we used a sum probability distribution here. There are other ways you could do this, but here we use this method. You see that these cases are all experiencing long-term exponential trends or exponential-like trends. This model fits well, and you could look at the actual nonlinear model. Just did it here linearly for presentation purposes by taking the log transformation of the sum probability distribution. So they're all undergoing exponential population growth. At the same time, they are all intensifying their production. In the ancestral Pueblo, the Mogollon region, Titicaca, and northern Chile in the Atacama, people are investing over time in more and more landscape engineering. They're investing more in irrigation. They're investing in raised fields. They're investing in check dams. They're investing in terraces along hill slopes to slow down runoff. So they're investing in more and more of these types of landscape modification. They are investing in this technological intensification strategy. In the Fremont region and in central west Argentina, they are uncannily similar, even though they are on different continents. People intensify their production in a very different way. They invest in agriculture, but they also invest in hunting and gathering strategies. And we see these large shifts between hunting and gathering, or we see this diversity of hunting and gathering and agricultural production, in which people, for instance, in their bone chemistry buried a mere 5 kilometers apart, one person will have all of their diet coming from wild resources, and another person has almost all of their diet, for instance, coming from maize in central west Argentina. So you get this really mix of strategies on the landscape, much more diverse, and you don't see the large irrigation features. You don't see raised fields. You don't see this large scale investment in landscape modification. However, in the other 4 case studies, if you look at everybody's, for instance, in the ancestral Pueblo, after a couple thousand years of population growth, everybody's eating maize all the time, lots and lots of maize and turkeys. Okay, the same thing's going on in the Atacama Desert. The same thing is going on in the Titicaca Basin. Everybody's eating agricultural products and pastoralist products with a very low supplement from wild resources. Okay, so we have these long-term population time series. We have these different trajectories of ecological and technological intensification, North and South America. So then we look at the growth rates. That's what you see over here. We've looked at the growth rates instead of the long-term trends. and so that we can actually look at the distribution of growth rates and the sensitivity of these systems to volatility, whatever those sources of volatility might be that we're hitting those systems. One thing I would just point out here is you will notice at the end of these sequences, you're getting, in most cases, Titicaca the least, but even here, you're getting the biggest collapse events. These are negative growth rates at the ends of these sequences, okay? So after 4,000 years of very long-term population growth, you're getting these large-scale collapse events there. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. Okay, so what we did is we took all of these growth rates and we looked at the distributions, and then we log transformed them into power functions as we did up here. And then we compared the slopes of the lines for our ecological intensification cases. That's Fremont and Northwest Patagonia or Central West Argentina, and our technological intensification cases, the ancestral Pueblo, the Mogollon, and northern Chile and the Titicaca Basin. And we would expect that these technological intensification cases would have a much steeper slope. They're better at regulating the exposure of the population to volatility, but they will have really rare collapse events. That's the prediction. The ecological intensification cases will experience more variability normally, but they won't have the really rare collapse events. Those are the two predictions. So we can do this by looking at the distributions and fitting the slopes. And in this case, we used a mixed effects model to ask if there are differences in the slopes of the distribution of growth rates between ecological intensification cases and technological intensification cases. The dotted line here is the mean slope of all cases. So to test our hypothesis or our basic prediction is that these ecological intensification cases would have a significantly less steep slope than the technological intensification cases. This is just the agricultural portions of the radiocarbon curve, or what we're using as our population curve. And as you can see here, when we look at the four cases that underwent technological intensification, the slope is much steeper. These cases are less sensitive to volatility. Their populations are less sensitive anyway. Their populations are changing a lot less. The proportion of growth rates is much smaller. In most growth rates are very, very small. The ecological intensification cases, the slope of this line is more shallow, indicating more sensitivity to disturbance. Now over here, we did this plot as a control. This is the hunter-gatherer portions of the sequence of these radiocarbon curves, so before agriculture is adopted. And in all 6 of these cases, the hunter-gatherers were very similar to each other. They were all harvesting terrestrial resources primarily, and focused on plants with a very little supplement of animals. And so we went ahead and ran the same analysis on those parts of the curve as kind of a control, and we see no difference between these 6 cases in terms of their sensitivity, the sensitivity of the populations, which is good. That's what we would expect based on their ecological adaptation, for instance. So yeah, we ran that as a control. So if you break this apart and look at each case individually, so I aggregated here the technological intensification case studies and the ecological intensification case studies. Let's break it apart and look at them individually. These 4 here are our technological intensification studies, case studies. Again, we have the log of the size of a fluctuation, or the log of a population growth rate. And then this is the log of the proportion of fluctuations. So most fluctuations are very tiny, a few are large. And again, you look at this steepness of the slope in these 4 technological intensification cases, you can see it's much steeper than the ecological intensification cases. So these cases seem to be more sensitive to disturbance and volatility the populations do over time. Okay, so that's the first prediction, is the data are consistent with the first prediction. But what about this prediction about the long-term or the most severe population collapse? That the cases that underwent technological intensification, although they're more robust, most of the time they experience the most severe, more severe population collapses because of the inherent fragility of the systems. We find absolutely no evidence to support that prediction. So over here, we're looking at the sensitivity coefficient, alpha, which is the slope of these lines. So each line has a slope. That's our sensitivity coefficient. And here we're looking at the max absolute growth rate. So that is the biggest one-time decline or biggest one-time increase in population. We're really interested in the biggest one-time decline in population. All right, so there is really no relationship between, in these 6 cases, the sensitivity of the system to disturbance and the one-time biggest decrease. This kind of looks like there's really no trend there. It's just flat. And then these are the ecological case studies. You can see the slopes are smaller. There's really no relationship there. We also looked using climate models. We looked at the stability of temperature and rainfall, and thinking that, in places where temperature is less stable, that is, temperature is bouncing around more, the population might bounce around more. It might circumvent the regulatory mechanisms that humans are implementing through their food production strategies. And we don't really see much of a relationship there either between temperature stability over the last 4,000 years and the sensitivity coefficient alpha, or the maximum negative growth rate and temperature stability. What we do find, though, that comes up, over and over again, no matter how we reconstruct the radiocarbon records to try and look for biases, is that we rank the 6 cases in terms of their political complexity. So they're most complex, at their most complex point over the last 4,000 years, in terms of economic and political complexity, we rank them. So Titicaca would be the highest, Ancestral Pueblo would be the second highest, so on and so forth. And we use the size of archaeological sites to estimate that. Because there is a strong relationship, at least cross-culturally, between the size of cities and or sites, monumental centers, and political economic complexity. So what we do see is that actually societies that became really complex socially or political in terms of their political economy actually experienced the smallest negative growth rates. So that's quite fascinating. So what? So what we've learned here potentially is that the intensification of production associates with less sensitivity to disturbance, as we would expect. This is a regulatory mechanism. But that does create fragility to rare collapse events. So we see that in all of our cases. But perhaps more technological intensification doesn't make you more sensitive to a rare collapse event than a case that is engaged in ecological intensification. And the reason we think this might be, this is speculation, is that we can decompose these collapse events into a depopulation event, which is what we were looking at, and social transformation. And so the kind of idea is, as you get a depopulation event, this realization of systemic risk in the population system, there is social transformation. But in a low complexity system like Central West Argentina, population starts to go down and things start to get disrupted. People just move away, they go away, and that exacerbates and makes it look like a big depopulation event. But the lifeways haven't changed that much. Whereas in the Titicaca Basin, we have really high complexity. That late population collapse event is associated with really massive social changes, including the collapse of the Tiwanaku state. And so when that happens, people can't easily migrate anywhere. They're stuck there. So there's a depopulation event happening but it doesn't look as big as other cases where you have lower social complexity or political economic complexity because the people are stuck there. But the social transformation is still quite large. The lifeways are changing pretty dramatically. So that's sort of what we've been speculating based on these 6 case studies. Of course, there are only 6 case studies, which is a problem. So one of the things that's really interesting about this is, does intensification on plants and infrastructure, and substituting infrastructure for natural capital or natural infrastructure result in these kind of boom-bust, big boom-bust that we think are going on in these 6 case studies. So to really get at those mechanisms, we need to drill in deeper and look at some case studies in more detail, in which we can actually track infrastructure changes and changes in diet in a more detailed way, and track changes in population in a detailed way. So we started to do this to see if the mechanisms that we think are operating really are operating. And right now we're looking at a couple of cases, again, Northwest Patagonia and Central Texas, to answer this question. And one of the reasons we're looking at these 2 cases is that they have important similarities. So again, I said there's this long-term exponential increase in those 6 case studies. As we've broken this down more, what we're starting to learn is that there are actually waves of density-dependent population growth. These curves are better characterized by by populations growing in sort of a logistic form, and then some kind of innovation and moving to a new logistic growth function. And so in Northwest Patagonia and Central Texas, we see what we're calling a population regime shift around 4,000 to 3,500 years ago. We have large radiocarbon data sets in these cases, and we have large bone chemistry data sets in these cases, as well as other ways of looking at the intensification of these systems. So to see, okay, if we're seeing this truly density dependent population growth process, as we move into a phase of competition where density dependence is high, do we see a doubling down on intensification and substituting technological capital for natural capital? And do we see big collapse events that follow from that strategy, or follow on from that strategy, indicating some kind of sensitivity there? So if we look in Texas and Northwest Argentina, as I said, we see very similar growth curves. So we see this logistic population growth. Here, I have marked 2 important points. This is Northwest Argentina on the top, Central Texas on the south, or on the bottom, excuse me. This point here is where this growth curve shifts from a cooperative phase of population growth to a competitive phase, a density-dependent phase of population growth. Same thing going on here in Texas. They shift a little bit, about 300 years different. In Argentina, it's around 2000. In Texas, it's around 1700 or 1800 Cal BP. Okay, so what you see is this growth, and it's kind of a boom, bust, boom, major bust. You've got this growth, you get into competitive phase, boom, bust, boom, major bust. All right, we're seeing this. Is this intensification preceding this boom bust pattern in a similar way in both cases, as we might expect it to increase the fragility of these population systems? So I'm just going to look at Texas in detail. So here we have the population curve, and we're tracking bone chemistry data. In this part of the world, we're looking at C13 appetite, which is a measure of, it's given us an indication of the whole diet of people in this region. And in particular, as it goes down and becomes more negative, it's suggesting more use of plant resources. C13 collagen in this part of the world is more focused, indicative of protein use. In this case, as it goes down, we're looking at less use of protein from large-bodied animal, in particular bison, but also deer, and more use of smaller-bodied animals. In this graph here, we're looking at some probability distribution of ages associated with a particular feature on the landscape called burned rock middens. Bird rock middens are huge middens, typically 10 meters. What defines a bird rock midden is it's 10 meters in diameter and usually a meter in depth of fire-cracked rock and ash. Many of them are much larger than 10 meters. Some of them are a hectare in size. You're literally just walking on a mound of fire-cracked rock and ash. These result from the intensive use of very large earth ovens. We're talking about ovens that are typically 1.5 meters in diameter or more and 1 meter in depth that are lined with rocks. And then people are putting wild onions and all kinds of wild tubers in them, roasting them, and then cleaning them out and eating those foods. And as they do that over and over, the rock breaks and cracks, and then they throw the rock out, and you get these huge middens. Clearly, with the size of these middens, they're being used over and over and over and over again. So this is what I'm talking about with infrastructure. You're using this technological infrastructure. You're really trying to intensify on this one type of plant resource. Okay, so as we look at this population curve here, it's growing logistically. It's moving from its cooperative to its competitive phase. The bird rock middens are being used, and they're increasing in a curved linear way. It's hard to pick it up here, but they're increasing. Their use is increasing, or dates associated with these are increasing. As we hit the competitive phase of the growth cycle, there's a doubling down on this intensification. And boom, people are using these things over and over and over again, and they peak in use right here around 800 cal-BP just before this second population peak. At the same time, we're seeing this decline in C13 appetite values. It's a subtle decline during the cooperative phase, but then it really goes down during the competitive phase of population growth. And then we get this population collapse at 600 BP, and we see a release of these values. The same thing is going on here. Protein sources from smaller and smaller animals, especially during this competitive phase. And then we see a release up here, hunting more large-bodied animals again, like bison, after this secular decline in population or rapid population collapse. So we see this doubling down on intensification associated with this kind of boom-bust cycle, and intensification peaks and specialization in small animals and plants peaks right before you see this large-scale population decline, which is what we would expect if this intensification process is occurring and it's making the system, population system, more fragile. We see a similar dynamic in Central West Argentina or Northwest Argentina. Here I'm just looking at the competitive phase of population growth. Again, you see this boom, bust, boom, and then collapse dynamic. Here we're just looking at the C13 collagen bone chemistry. And in this part of the world, as the values get less negative, we're getting more use of maize here. This is a very clear signal of more use of maize. And just what I'm showing you here is we go into this competitive phase around 2000. We get this filling in of maize use and much more intensive use of maize. There's a bust. People use a little bit less maize. Then you get this boom. People use more maize and they get more invested in this strategy. And then the population decline comes down, and you see there's this sort of release signal again where people are not using as much maize, but you'll see there are not many data points out here because the cemeteries also go away. So cemeteries are coming in with more intensive production of maize, which is typically what happens with more territorial control. And then late here, as the population collapses, the cemeteries go away, and we're getting, again, less use of maize. So again, this is consistent. We get into this competitive phase, you get this kind of boom-bust dynamic, and the diet seems to track that with really intensive use of plant resources and infrastructure related to cemeteries preceding these bust periods. Okay, so I'll conclude. Basic insight of these models is partly supported. Intensification of production associates with less sensitivity to disturbance, and we do see that intensification of production seems to make systems within themselves more fragile and more sensitive to kind of big population collapses. In the long run, the social dynamics between cases may impact how severe of a collapse we see in the population system. And that probably has a lot to do with the ability to migrate or the cost of migrating in different political economic contexts. At least we think that might be what's going on. And we have a lot of gaps to sort out. And in particular, this gap in knowledge between the collapse of the social system and the collapse of the population system. And is there indeed a positive correlation between those two things? In order to do that, we've got to build database infrastructure to be able to compare more than 6 cases. 6 cases is interesting, but really we need dozens of cases to sort out what's going on and surprise ourselves and look at the different trajectories of change that we might see. So this is exactly what we're doing in the People 3000 research group. One of our goals is to evaluate systemic risk from the long-term perspective offered by the integrated analysis of models, paleo data. We've been doing this with different papers that we've published. This is one here. I went over one a little bit earlier. And in order to do this, we want to describe and explain the basic patterns of human population ecology, integrating models of paleopopulation, paleoecological, and paleosocial data. We've been really good so far at developing database infrastructure for trying to measure changes in population across the globe. We're really invested in this right now. We've published, or it's in press, I guess technically, a paper in Nature Data Science that publishes this global radiocarbon data set. This is an old map. There are actually many more data points now. We currently have a Pages Data Stewardship Scholarship, and we are applying through the NSF for an HNDS grant, a Human Network Data Science grant, to integrate these radiocarbon records with paleoecological and paleosocial records. And then we are also, again, integrating in phase 2 of our research group, paleoenvironmental and paleosocial data. That is the key component of phase 2 of our group. So we've got this radiocarbon infrastructure. We're trying to look at long-term changes in population. Now we're trying to do that in a context that's more informed by social and subsistence changes and changes in paleoecology. With that, I will say thank you for listening. That went a little longer than I had hoped, but thank you so much for your attention.